I'm especially excited for our guest today. Um, I think we all, especially after January 6th, but I mean, for a lot of us, even before then, the question of fascism it has been on our minds. The question of Nazis, not only in our country, but abroad, and the history of Nazism, because a lot of people were asking, well, wait a minute, with Trump and everything else happening, could this happen to us? I think we always think of like, oh no, I think someone in Twitter phrased it beautifully, where they're like, we talk about Nazis as if we're viewing it in our rearview mirror. And I love that analogy. So we have a literal subject matter expert here with us today who's going to share a little bit about his expertise. And we're going to dig into some of those questions that I know a lot of you guys have on how close did America get to the brink of full blown fascism or Nazism. And then also talk a little bit about the history and warning signs, because I know we all want to make sure that we are doing our part to prevent fascism from taking hold in this country. So I'm going to switch over to our guest, Jay Weixelbaum. And
You got it.
yes, guys, I'm very particular about getting names right. So I was practicing earlier, but Jay, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So before we get started, I'd love for you to take a moment to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your area of expertise. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm Dr. Jason Weixelbaum. Friends call me Jay. I have a PhD in history. My expertise is American companies that did business with Nazi Germany, that history, which means I cite a lot of related topics, including fascism, including American politics and economics, business history, the Holocaust.
Mhm.
And I also am a science writer, a political writer, a musician, and now a filmmaker as well.
Oh, exciting.
And Yeah, so I have lots of hats, a hat collection now.
Oh man, so many hats of all shapes and sizes. So I'm I'd love to start sort of with history. We'll get to modern day, but maybe I think for people to understand what Nazism is, what it stands for, how it happened, historically, that I think is going to give us a better foundation to really understand how it almost happened again. So I guess my question is, how the heck did Nazism um, take foot or take hold in Germany and other countries earlier in the 20th century?
Yeah, I absolutely. I'm really happy you asked me that because the thing I've been harping on a lot on Twitter and elsewhere lately is that we use terms a lot without really taking a second to think about what they mean and defining them. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, of course, that's always going to change. Um, the humanities and these things are subjective, but there is also a science and kind of a shared consensus among scholars who are serious and about studying this stuff and have spent years studying it. So there is some. It's not like we can't know anything, but we can definitely know fascism, and fascism experts, define it as kind of like hyper nationalism. There's typical ethno nationalism. There's typically kind of bigotry and kind of a supremacy, an ethno nationalist supremacy involved. There's usually some bit of misogyny, kind of hierarchical sense of like, man over woman, white over people of color, Christian over Jew, straight over, over homosexual, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. Um, and um, and then what also is kind of a hallmark identifier combined with that is like authoritarianism. So it's always like kind of a slavish obedience to leader.
Mm-hmm.
And then another really important aspect is like facts don't matter, like whatever the leader says matter, and like being able to kind of warp reality around ideology. And This is kind of fascism is kind of known as a like intense right wing populism,
Hmm.
and populism is also something that's worth just briefly mentioning. Is kind of like this idea that like populists are all about grievance and a sense of victimhood and like stoking personal anger, and it's always like in service to some cause, but like the anger is the priority.
Hmm.
So like, you know, it'd be like I'm mad, you know, about, you know, XYZ, but it really like they're mad and they want to stay mad and they want to find excuses to be mad. So these things kind of all mix together in this toxic gross
Yeah.
mix. But okay, but I'm let me so to answer your question, how did it start? Well, I mean, I mean, these things come out of extreme changes. Typically, populism is kind of always there under the surface, and it has different flavors depending on the country. And America has a very kind of populist tradition, but it's not
Hmm.
the only country. It's Germany, and Germany was, you know, a newish country at the point of World War One,
Hmm.
which is kind of where fascism really starts, because Germany loses, and then that kind of gives people an excuse to say they didn't lose. Tell me when this sounds familiar. That like the victory was stolen from them. That they
Hmm.
created this whole reality that they actually won. If only they weren't betrayed by X, Y, and Z, which of course happens to be left-leaning people, socialists, and the Jews, of course, because it's very popular to blame Jews for everything.
I'm already
Uh,
seeing some parallels, but
yeah.
yeah.
See, you start to kind of see it as you see the same things popping up over and over again. And you know, Hitler was one of many right wing leaders in Germany in the early 20s in the post World War One era. And but he had a he paid a lot of attention. This is another thing with fascism. He paid a lot of attention to media and
Mm,
how to use the media to his advantage,
mm,
to kind of create the story, not just get media to report on him, but to be the one actually making the story, making the news. Um,
yeah.
and You know, I mean, you people can find all sorts of stuff about the history of Nazi Germany all over the place, but basically, even though he had like kind of a little failed revolution, which again is unfortunate that there's parallels here in the mid 20s. He was
Yeah.
put in jail, but he wrote a book. It was super popular, and then by
Mm,
the late 20s, his party was outlawed, but by the late 20s, it was unoutlawed again. And there's something else you mentioned, I think, that is another parallel. You know, he went into the Nazi Party went to government. They
hmm.
started getting seats in basically their version of Congress.
Hmm.
But what would happen is they would go in, and Congress would start, and they would go to pass laws, and you know the functioning of government. All the Nazis would stand up, smiling, and then march out of there in protest, and they'd go right
Oh.
to a press conference and say, "See, government doesn't work, so you should elect more of us." Meanwhile, they're the ones, of course, paralyzing the government. Again,
Wow.
sound familiar?
Yes.
So you know, ultimately, they again parallel. They spent a lot of time looking at where there were weaknesses in their constitution that they could take power. Hitler bullied his way into being appointed chancellor, and then used those loopholes with kind of a fake attack on the Reichstag. They It's never been proven, but we think Nazis did basically lit their parliamentary building on fire, then claimed that communists did it, and then Hitler used loopholes in the Constitution to take full control, and then that's kind of the rest is history. So that's
Wow.
the really short version of how the Nazis took power. But of course, my area is that there were many kind of enablers in America along the way,
I
and
was that was my next line of
yeah,
questioning. So,
yeah,
yeah, let's
yeah.
talk about the American enablers, like because Americans weren't innocent in this, right? Especially when business interests are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to look at history with hindsight, but I mean, if you were to teleport yourself back to America and say the late 1930s, now this is of course a little bit later than the story I've just told. Hitler's been in power for a while. He's building up his military. He's gotten some international clout. They had the Olympic Games in Berlin, and then
That's
he's
right.
kind of pressuring other more powerful countries to start annexing pieces of his neighbors, claiming he's the same victim narrative over and over again. So, but in the late 30s, the American public was, it was not clear that America would be going to war with Germany just within a few years. American public was kind of split, and that's because, again, parallels. There were, radio was a new medium, and one of the most popular radio personalities was this very right wing guy named Charles Coughlin. He was a Catholic
Hmm.
priest, and he would proselytize, and he became a fan of the Nazis and started talking, and initially he had some good feelings about FDR, thought he was a fellow populist, but by the late 30s was just viciously attacking FDR and saying, the
Wow.
Nazis, repeating the Nazi criticisms of America, kind of, and all the bigotry and anti-socialist things you can imagine, and
Mhm.
millions of people listen to this guy. Um, and he was coming out of Detroit, and of course, another big personality in Detroit was Henry Ford, who had
Mhm.
also, for years, published similar attacks, even more blatantly pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic attacks, to the point where actually he was sued for defamation, and the newspaper he had bought to publish these attacks had to be shut down. He had to give an apology, and so there were. What I'm trying to say is there were many kind of outlets for this kind of pro-Nazi message, and then in fact there was basically a neo-Nazi part, or not neo. There was a Nazi party in America called the American Bund. Bund in German means like group or club,
Okay.
essentially.
Wound.
And lots of people joined this Bund. It was run by a guy named Fritz Kuhn, who was pretty corrupt, but he had
Wow.
thousands of members, and in fact showed of made a show of force in New York City in 1939. Had this huge march through the middle of New York City to Madison Square Garden, where his group had rented it out to have this giant Nazi rally. Of course, replete with violence.
Hmm.
There were fights that broke out. This Jewish plumber jumped on stage and tried to stop one of the speakers, and these like Nazi tough guys are like beating him up on stage. It was a gross, scary, awful situation, this is in late 1939, so it goes to show you that like there were definitely like factions in America that were not anti-Nazi, that were very openly pro-Nazi.
Wow. Wow. And so, like, in thinking about, so I know we talked about Henry Ford and some of the other, and did this continue through World War II? Because I know obviously a lot of this probably started earlier before the Nazis truly became adversaries or opponents of the United States. So, what did that look like as Nazism transitioned from just simply being the ruling party in Germany to World War II and
Right.
conflict?
Right. I mean, the turning point. So, spoiler alert. Well, not spoiler alert. I said I was a filmmaker earlier. I founded a production company to uh, make a short film to pitch a series on 1940, because I think 1940 is
Mm.
in New York, but 1940 in America is really kind of the turning point. I think that up until that point, there were still people. I mean, there were a lot of people who just didn't. They had bad feelings about World War One. They were isolationists. They didn't want America getting involved in European politics. They had already seen that happen. Lots of Americans had died. It was not a good feeling. World War One was not a good memory to most Americans. So even the ones that weren't like, "Hey, I like Hitler," it was just like, I don't want to get involved with that,
Hmm.
and then the people I study, American businessmen, many of them were just like, hey, Germany just wants its place in the sun. They just want to do their thing, and if they're good business partners, we're all about it. We want to make money. I mean, the rules had just been changed in the late 20s so that American companies could move overseas and form subsidiaries in other countries.
That's
And
right.
so this was a big deal to big companies like General Motors, like IBM, like Ford,
Hmm.
which are the three companies I wrote about in my dissertation,
Ah.
where they're actually public records available,
Hmm.
publicly accessible. Well, somewhat publicly accessible records. There's a whole story
Right.
there, but
I'm sure. Oh my God. Well, for anyone who like has either themselves or family who have been in academia, just trying to find, sources and usable records to verify so many things that might already be like common knowledge, but when you're writing an academic paper, you need those like tangible sources. And my God, sometimes I think it would shock people. But
yeah,
anyways,
yeah.
that is a conversation for another time. I will hit you up when we decide to get into the weeds on that one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, just
But
as an aside, I mean, the one of the reasons I got the PhD in the first place, the problem with my field is that there's a lot of like kind of conspiracy books out there. Folks
mm,
who are kind of amateur historians who want to get into the archives, and that's great. The problem is that it can really, if you don't have the training, it can, and you don't, because like you're really beaten up in grad school to like think critically and look at sources, read critically, and it's a muscle. But if you're just
mm,
kind of just jumping into the archives and you don't have any of that background, it's a really easy game of telephone. Falsehoods get repeated, they get mixed with true things, then
mm-hmm.
nothing's reliable. And then some people are kind of out there to just make a name for themselves, say sensationalist things. All
Yeah.
gets mixed together. And so the reason I kind of kept going to grad school and get encouraged to is that my field has kind of bad reputation for all that. So like
Mm,
you have to kind of like work twice as hard, right?
right.
You have to do your homework and make sure you're at the top of the class. And so I had to really push hard in order to do that. And then when I finally got to the sources, these many of these companies don't necessarily, even though they've made them public to as a show of good faith,
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily want you to have as much access and to get real serious about them.
Of course, right?
So
It's that whole thing of like, oh no, but we did our part. We're being transparent, but then like behind barbed wire and lasers, and they're like, yeah, it's right there. You can get it if you want to like review it. This is our good showing of good faith. When yeah, maybe they also realize that it doesn't necessarily put them in portray them in the best light.
right,
So
right.
yeah, sorry, that was a tangent, but
No,
continue.
yeah.
So these companies, move subsidiaries or were able to move abroad.
Yeah, yeah. So, specifically, the stuff I studied is these. They formed subsidiaries in Germany. Germany's up and coming. This Hitler guy takes over. He wants to build up the military. There's lots of government spending. I mean,
Hmm.
that's an attractive place for a company like, say, General Motors to be. General Motors bought out outright the basically one of the biggest car makers in Europe, this company called Opel, still exists.
Huh.
And then it was interesting because the question I get asked a lot is at what point were the Americans involved and when did they finally go away? Because people figure when World War II finally happens and there's it's got to be outlawed, right? Like
Right.
they can't still be in charge. And it was kind of clever what they did. I mean, there's Trading with the Enemy Act is what it was. But what was happening was, and this started before official acts of war, before Pearl Harbor, when Germany
Hmm.
declared war on the United States and then brought the U.S. in the war. The U.S. did not declare war on Germany first, but anyway, so what big corporations did, like General Motors, was they basically like schmoozed with Nazis and found ones that they thought would be loyal to the company
Hmm.
and still had Nazi ties. But would implement their policy and be
Huh.
like kind of a caretaker. A custodian was actually the legal term, but they would handpick people to stay at
Interesting.
the top of the company, at the top of these boards of directors, controlling boards, supervisory boards, what they call them,
Hmm.
so then they could kind of pull back when the time came. So in 1940 41 was really that period of time where it was like, oh shoot, we're going to war in Europe. We got to start pulling our people out because this is starting to look bad. But we put this loyal Nazi in charge, and he'll take care of stuff. And in fact, in most cases, that's exactly what happened. These loyal Nazis were able to take care of American company property all the way through the war, and kind of give the plausible deniability, this legal separation that Americans were involved when in fact they still owned and basically were still their wishes of what they wanted the company to do were still being fulfilled.
That's wild. And when you think about it, they could presumably have been making profits that on sales generated by Nazi Germany, and that capital would just be sent back to American companies or vice versa. And it sounds like that their main strategy then was having folks in Germany, but just there were how do you what was some of the criteria they looked for like whether or not someone was going to be loyal to the company or loyal to Nazi Germany? Because I mean, just considering how volatile things were at that time, I mean, you have to be damn sure. Like what did that look like?
I mean, I think it was a lot of personal relationships, and you can kind of tell
Yeah.
pretty quickly when it's like a frothy, like ideological Nazi versus I'm just part of this regime and I just want to make money and I'm
Right.
corrupt and I'm with this
Mm,
genocidal regime, but I'm not like a true believer.
right.
General Motors is a good case because there was kind of a true believer in charge, and the I mean, one of the things I try to prove in my dissertation or
Hmm.
argue was that Americans, the Americans who were involved in this relationship, the companies argued later that they had no choice. The Nazis did whatever they wanted. They were in control. They bullied them. But what I
Hmm.
was trying to prove was that the Americans were aware they had agency, they had the ability to decide, and they knew it. They knew they had the ability to decide. And
Yep.
one of the examples I give is that they had this kind of true believer guy on the General Motors board in Germany, the Opel board, and they got rid of him and replaced him with a guy who stayed on the rest of the time,
Wow.
who was fine. So it's like, yes, they can make their own choices. So it's a lot of like person to person relations. But there's one thing I wanted to go back to for a second. It's kind
Yeah.
of a debunked myth. Is that yes, this was for profit, obviously, but the irony is most of these companies didn't actually make any money. Ultimately, they all
Really?
kind of lost money on this deal. So it was their reputations are spoiled for all time, but then they didn't actually make money.
Yeah.
And and so
Yeah.
this is how I explain it: is imagine this, like, okay, you're CEO of X corporation. You go, and it's 1940. It's late 1945. The war's over. You finally get to go visit the plant. You have no idea what's been going on because bombers been flying over Germany, bombing everything, the
Hmm.
RAF and the U.S. Forces.
Yeah.
You get there, your factory's like a smoking wreck. So you've already lost money there. You've got to rebuild your factory. And then you go to your bank account, and you've got a full bank account full of Nazi Reichsmarks for a regime that is defeated. Where are you going to spend that money? So, so then Germany
Wow.
finally has to do this whole reevaluation thing, and the money is like a tenth of the value. And in some
Hmm.
cases, if your machinery was behind the lines that the Soviets had crossed,
Hmm.
they have uprooted, literally unbolted the entire factory and moved it to Russia. they take
Oh
so
my God.
and bank accounts too. They've seized the bank accounts. They've taken everything.
Of course.
So the biggest payout I ever found, and this may boil the blood of some of your listeners, is
Hmm.
true. There goes my camera.
That's okay.
But it is that the largest payout I ever found was to General Motors. It was from the American government. General Motors uh, applied for a basically this fund that was created for American property that was damaged in the war with Europe. So they actually it was a $10 million fund, and General Motors said, well, all our property was damaged by bombs. Their factory complex in Weixelbaum outside of Frankfurt was
Mhm.
completely destroyed. They were like, well, we want compensation from the American government for the bombing of our factories that were, of course, building armaments to fight against the American military. Oh, and then during the negotiations, I found paperwork that they were so kind as to take the slave labor barracks off their request. So they weren't gonna charge
So kind.
American government for those. But we ended up paying out the Americans ended up paying General Motors $10 million for the bombing damage to their German factories ultimately.
Wow. That's wild. And that's money they were compensating the company because I mean, ultimately what happened was that the company chose to do business um, in Germany, even though, Nazi Germany, using the justification that, oh, well, it's a business decision and we have no choice but to do this. I mean, this is our business. We are established there. We can't just uproot and whatever. That's whatever. And benefited, like, I would imagine that, like, they benefited from like the Nazi government in some capacity or something. And then when that was affected, they were compensated for that and
Yeah.
compensated for whatever was destroyed. That is wild.
I
Oh
mean, we
my.
can go deeper into the weeds. The problem on before all that was that they had to say they weren't making profits because then the taxes were so high in Nazi Germany because they wanted to build their military.
Mm.
Germany had actually not a great economy. They need to basically start a war to save their economy, and so they had to basically buy a bunch of land and new factories. They kind of got into this loop where it's like, okay, I can't show I'm the American business holder. I can't show profits. I'm going to buy a new tank factory and hide the money, and so they got it was just it was kind of this sunk cost fallacy where they just got stuck getting deeper and deeper involved in the Nazi war machine. Is in some ways like if it didn't have such tragic consequences, you might feel bad for them, but of course
Right. Well,
it
and so
does.
is
So
that one of the key contributors then to them not making money on this on doing business in Nazi Germany was the fact that they would just keep to so it sounds like there was an intentional it was intentional that they didn't want to show profits. Like, is that something that was
yeah, yeah,
so
because
it's
the Nazi taxman would take their profits, and they couldn't get their money back to the America because Henry
right.
Morgenthau, who was the American Treasury Secretary, a Jewish guy, was like,
Mhm.
no, like you're not, we're not letting you bring your ill-gotten gains back. Deal with the Nazis. So, and they tried all companies tried all sorts of fancy ways to try to get the money through. I mean, and some of it may have gotten through Switzerland. And that's not stuff I have access to.
Yeah,
I
no one does.
I don't think it was a lot because I'm able to look at least on the American side where
Mm.
the money came from, unless they like kept it hidden there. But I know we're straying a little bit further away from the question your listeners want to hear about, which is like America now and what can we do? And so
Right.
I
No,
want to
I
make
know, but
sure we talk about
sorry,
that.
I know. I this is so fascinating. Because I don't think anyone realized just just how much was done behind the scenes. And I mean, God, it's funny because I feel like companies are doing the same sort of justifications now. I mean, that's why our country as a whole is propping up regimes like Saudi Arabia and Arab Emirates, right? It's like not there. These are essentially like authoritarian regimes that commit massive human rights violations, but we don't really do anything about it because of all the business interests there. So,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, but yeah, so let's, having all of this as context for what is happening historically, let's bring it into the 21st century. Um, because I'm guessing this probably started, or maybe didn't, before Trump,
yeah.
where we see inklings of fascism either taking hold in America or businesses working with fascist regimes. I'd love for you to sort of set the stage on, like, coming from World War II to now, and
Yeah.
it's in the
Yeah.
modern era. What's happened? Like, what should
The,
we?
the first thing I think of is something Merrick Garland recently said during his confirmation hearings. He said, there's a through line from the Oklahoma City bombing, which he's famous for prosecuting.
Hmm.
It was by a white supremacist, Timothy McVeigh. He said there's a through line from Oklahoma City to January 6th,
Hmm.
to the attack on our capital. And then he also said, and there's a direct line from the violence of the Ku Klux Klan in the Reconstruction era during this kind of home rule period after federal troops were pulled out of the South after the election in 1877. From there to Oklahoma City. So there's kind of this through line of like right wing populism. Of course, the most extreme version in the modern sense is fascism, that goes all the way through. Um, and of course, a lot of bad faith arguments on the internet try to talk about the Democrats as being the party of the Ku Klux Klan. But since the 1920s, in particular, there's been this kind of fascist strain in the Republican Party and Republican Party history, and it's kind of waned and waxed. And but the 1920s, which is kind of this populist era, not just in the U.S. but also abroad, right wing authoritarianism. There were all these kind of little Hitlers all around Eastern Europe. You had Mussolini, you had a civil war in Spain, and a fascist dictator there, and of course in America you had three Republican administrations in a row. You had Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, and this was an era of extreme right wing ideology. The Klan, there was a Klan resurgence during that period of time. Some of the most draconian immigration laws, very nativist, xenophobic mood in the country. Some of the most vicious immigration laws were passed during this period by Republicans as conservative right-wing Supreme Court judges. There was it was very right-wing economic policies. There was a famous Supreme Court case called Lochner versus New York, and led to this thing called the Lochner era, which is very laissez-faire. You can't regulate businesses at all. People were very anti-socialist and anti-left-wing. So this is not a great time to be left-wing at this period of time. So of course, I mean, not of course, because there's always contingency, but it's predictable that in the 30s, a bunch of Republican politicians, most notably Charles Lindbergh, who really courted Nazis and Nazi ideology, came up with this thing called America First, which you might have heard of recently. Again,
Wow.
yeah, they came up with that, which is it's hyper nationalism, which is how we open this conversation, right? That's the theme. It's like America first, and the irony is that nationalism is actually what made the Depression so bad, was that by putting up borders between countries, it kept capital from flowing and made the Depression worse. That's a different discussion. But of course, the right wing answer is like the opposite of whatever you need to do to fix the problem. It's very reactionary kind of approach. And so there were actually Nazi groups in the United States who were trying to fund Lindbergh to get rid of FDR, because they were worried FDR was starting to oppose Germany. He was starting to give aid. In the 1940s, this turning point, starting to give aid to Great Britain as things got closer and closer to war. And of course, once they went to war, America kind of did the Lend-Lease project and program and started helping. And so the Republicans are against all that. and the businessmen were not happy with that. And the Republican Party is made up of like kind of three pieces, right? It's like they call scholars smarter than me call it the three-legged stool. There's like the business people, and there's the religious people, the evangelicals, and then there's just like the ideological people, the libertarians, fascists. I mean, to me, they're interchangeable. That's also another discussion. So there's always been this tension between those three groups. But after World War II, and especially after, Democrats really became, during this period of time, the party of immigrants, the party of people of color. It took a couple decades. And then when the Civil Rights Acts got passed, then you really started to have this stronger marriage between those groups. That the fascists and the businessmen were going to kind of join forces with the evangelicals to take power, because they thought they were going to lose the white supremacy in America, which now they're saying the quiet part loud. They are literally saying that. But
it's not dog whistle politics.
Yeah.
It's like blowhorn.
Yeah. And the parable is just like the businessmen thought they could kind of navigate doing business with Nazis. It didn't work out ultimately. The business wing of Republican Party had a lot of power for a long time and was ascendant by the time you get to Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
They were in full power. Reagan won by a landslide, but at that point, there's this kind of uncontrolled group of these Nazi ideologues, and they knew
Mm-hmm.
they needed to take the media over. So they gradually corrupted the FCC and got rid of this thing called the Fairness Doctrine. And literally right around that time,
I
that's when you get Rush
preach.
Limbaugh and Fox News
Roger
and
Ailes, yeah.
Roger Ailes, and they are all about this like extreme right wing ideology. It's
Mm-hmm.
fascism, right?
Yep.
But it takes a while for this propaganda to get out and poison people's minds,
Mm-hmm.
and then they kind of grind the wheels down in government and then blame government for not working. Again, the same thing until you finally and then they kind of gaslight everybody like facts don't matter,
Yep.
like and so you and I think what ends up happening is it's this fight because they realize more this demographics change, the country becomes more urban, more and more, there are more and more people who aren't signing on to this ideology. Fox News's demographic gets older, and over time, and so time's running out. So that's what gets us to Trump, and then now it's like it's no longer a dog whistle, it's a bullhorn.
Yeah. No, okay, I mean, you follow me on Twitter, so maybe you've seen, but like I cannot I've been just trying to like my mission recently has been educating people on the fairness doctrine and like how that led to a sequence of events and paved the way for fake news, for propaganda, and why that's important. As someone who works, like on the professional side in the like media and digital space, I can't help but just like see the long-term ramifications of a decision like that and looking at, here's why men like Roger Ailes was so adamant to get rid of this thing. Like this is what he once you get rid of the fairness doctrine and deregulate so much of the media landscape, that allows you to essentially just push out whatever you want under the guise of being news, of being official,
Exactly.
and oh no, we're fair and balanced. I still love that that was whatever his name, Bill
Bill O'Reilly.
Bill O'Reilly. That's right.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a good thing that like it took me a while to think of his name. It means I'm in a better headspace.
It's good. He's still
But
out there. He's still
of
trying to make a
course,
buck, but
of
we don't
course.
want it. I mean, deplatforming. This is the great thing is
Hmm.
deplatforming works. He kind of deplatformed himself by missing the cues as our culture changed and
Hmm.
was booted out for sexual harassment and assault. I think was it the largest sexual assault
I
lawsuit payout in history, or was
I
there?
think so.
I
At the
think he's still the
time,
record holder, or at the time anyway.
I believe
Yeah,
so. Yeah, it because it was a decent amount, and there were those like freaking awful. What is it like the voicemails or whatever that he would send
yeah,
other women, and so much of
yeah.
it was kept under wraps. And then I think it came out like I don't know if it was the same year, but a few years later, the whole thing with Roger Ailes and how they had paid out like hundreds of millions of dollars just in like closed door settlements.
Yep.
And you would also like this is as an economics person, like when I see stuff like that and hearing this stuff about doing business with the Nazis or with fascist regimes, whatever, it blows my mind because I'm like, this isn't even a good business decision. Or for these
Right.
companies that end up keeping like abusers and others on staff, I'm like, do you realize, think about what you could have done with those hundreds of millions of dollars if you didn't have, well, A, that's only one piece of it, right? If you didn't have to pay off these women because your founder and CEO is a monster. But also think about just how much labor and like productivity and other things were lost because people were working in a hostile work environment. Like it's not even a good business decision to
Yeah.
keep these people, and yet, so it's like I mean, as a scholar, not only in like Nazism, but understanding the business implications, it must drive you insane to watch
Yeah.
history repeating itself.
It has not been an easy time to be a historian. For a bunch of reasons.
Hmm.
One being, that yeah, watching basically as soon as people die off that remember uh, World War II, we start repeating the same mistakes.
Hmm.
And just to backtrack, a lot of these folks aren't nearly as smart as they think they are. I think that's the common theme. Is that they're not even fulfilling their own goal. If their own goal is profit, making money, and so on.
Oh my God,
But
I
I
know.
mean, yeah. So being a historian is hard because there's very little money and even less glory in the first place, especially these days. I don't know. So not only is our media landscape, so the media landscape is corrupted and then
Hmm.
also gutted because media companies were folding and consolidating. So there's also kind of this just structural thing that's happening. But
Yeah.
then that's also happening in higher ed and in history
Yes.
departments. Many of my PhD cohort, a lot of us are underemployed because what
Hmm.
happened was in tandem during this Republican period, especially from the 70s onward, was that Republicans took over state legislatures and they don't like historians or humanities people because they,
Hmm.
they want to make up their own world where they are the kings and queens of whatever,
Yep.
so they cut budgets to state universities for decades. What would happen is state universities usually would cut humanities first before STEM. And especially when the recession of 2008 and 2009 10
Hmm.
hit, that process accelerated like gangbusters.
Wow.
Basically, uh, enrollment went way down. College administrators freaked out all over the United States and were like, everything needs to be job training there, which is ridiculous because the whole idea of a university is a whole person that gets
Yeah.
educated in the humanities so they
Al-
have critical thinking skills. But
Also, like, sorry, just one thing.
oh no,
Also,
go ahead.
like, as
It's
someone
your
who's
show.
worked in tech, my fiance still works in tech and he's an engineer. The one thing that I wish more engineers had, or folks that work in more like technical professional roles, is communication skills and
Yeah,
critical thinking skills, because so much of them, if you ask them to write code, they can write code all day long. It can be great. But if you ask them to explain to a room of non engineers why it's important and why they did what they did and to sell it in, none could not do it.
hey, they
Yeah,
should hire me.
right.
We're all underemployed. I'm one of those folks. I mean, I'm lucky enough that I'm working part-time right now, but it's
That's great.
COVID's been tough. But yeah, so
Yeah.
so all the jobs disappeared,
Hmm.
especially from 2010 onwards. Tenure track positions that paid between 60 and 80 grand a year were replaced by adjunct positions that paid roughly $4 to $5 an hour. And
Wow.
yeah, yeah, I think the last adjunct position, I did the math for the hourly rate, and it was around $3 an hour. And of course, I was working at a college in Baltimore that primarily serves people of color, so the price is even lower. The last job I was offered, I couldn't even take because it was just I can't afford to live on that. I would literally make more working in fast food, and that's the so it became a running joke between my colleagues and me
Mhm.
that it's probably easier to get a Netflix series greenlit than it is to get a tenure track position
I
as a
hope you prove
historian.
this. I hope you have the chance to prove this because
We're doing an experiment live. It's happening right now. So COVID hit. And we're all sitting around, and I'm like, well, do I write a book now? I have a dissertation
yeah.
already. That's typically what you do. But
Hmm.
I really like working with people.
Hmm.
And I didn't mention in my background, my father's last name is not Weixelbaum, it's West, because he was an actor. I grew up in
Ah.
Los Angeles because my dad was an actor in Hollywood
Hmm.
on movies and daytime shows
Oh,
and
that's
and
awesome.
so on, and so I always I had an idea that like some of the stuff that I was studying was not being shown on screen, and in fact, one of the like I wasn't, I mean, while I was working on my dissertation, I wasn't really thinking about I wanted to get done and I wanted to write a dissertation, not
Right.
a screenplay. But and one of the stories I uncovered I didn't really get to even use in my dissertation was this crazy story, incredible true story of there was so during this kind of corporate interaction, there were Germans and Americans going back and forth, and this one German, it's a small world. There's these
Hmm.
kind of top corporate lawyer guys who are doing the deals, and there's this German lawyer who became basically a high-level Nazi spy for the SS, German guy, and went
Wow.
on a spy mission to America in 1940, fake name and everything, with another spy who was a baroness, this like femme fatale, and this pair are in New York City, like dealing with all the top like American managers of major companies, Wall Street firms,
Wow.
and the FBI knew about it, and they were tracking him and trying to destroy his mission, and they eventually did. And I found out later that as I was doing research on this again, that it was a Jewish FBI agent that was chasing them around. So this is an incredible story. So I was continually kind of shocked that after every World War II movie, it seemed like they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. They're making up World War II myths. There's documentaries.
Yeah.
I had never seen a dramatization of this story on screen. So I
Wow.
started talking to my friends. I was like, "Hey, should we form a production company to try to do this?" And all of a sudden, I had screenwriters, I have some producers, some graphic designers, some composers, and you know, on no budget,
I
we are
mean,
cre- we are creating we create a production company. It is called Elusive Films with Elusive. Elusive Films. You can find us on social media to shoot basically a short film version of this incredible event that's kind of a climactic event where actually a bunch of these American corporate leaders celebrated with this Nazi spy when Paris fell to the Nazis in June of 1940. They're all
wow.
celebrating in this posh New York City hotel room. And we're going to shoot that and pitch it and see if we can make a series. We've written and copywritten some screenplays. We're about finished with a pilot episode and writing a treatment for our series. And what we're hoping to do is we're hoping to fund this short film through a combination of grants and a crowdfunding campaign. Is that's what you do, right?
Oh my
But I
gosh. Well,
figured,
tell me how to, like, when you guys set up the crowdfunding stuff, like
yeah.
I would love to promote this because I want to watch this. This sounds incredible.
Well, we wanted to do more than just ask people for money. So what we're doing what everybody else is doing during COVID. We're starting a podcast.
Of course.
It's called The Nazi on Wall Street, which is exactly the same name as the film and series we're promoting. We're going to talk about current events. We're going to have lots of conversations just like this, but
Mhm.
hopefully with some of the other historians I know as guests, and specific subject matter experts on, say, the history of the Republican Party, the history of white supremacism in America, and so on. And so that'll be the vehicle for our crowdfunding campaign throughout the middle of this year, and
Awesome.
we hope to raise enough to actually shoot this film. So
Yeah, I
thank you
mean,
so much for letting me get that out here. I really appreciate that.
oh my God, are you kidding? Of course. Like because this, I totally agree with you. We have had so many films, and I think also maybe this is a lot of it's because like people that end up greenlighting films or funding them are old white men. And what do old white men love the most? Stories about war and World War II, like back when we were great. Remember
Yep.
America? and and so we'll get all these, movies that have these fascinating battle scenes and whatever, and it really goes along the lines of the American military hero. But rarely, I mean, there are so many good stories out there just like that. I actually read a book about informants during World War II who acted as
Mm.
spies, and one of them was
Hmm.
this like British socialite who was famous. Like she was known for like being on the social scene, especially in France. And she
Hmm.
carried with her. She almost blew her cover because of her little dog that she carried with her everywhere. And I just remember reading this story. They had a few short stories about all the different um, you know, spies or informants that you would never know. One of them was this guy who all the information. He was a double agent. He was actually working for the British intelligence service, but the Germany thought he was an informant for them. And the way he got away with it is he would just every single transmission he sent back to the Germans was this like overly elaborate, descriptive, just like too many details, and
Mm-hmm.
all of it was bullshit. But like it was stuff that like they couldn't not verify. And that was his whole thing was he would just write these like incredibly long, flowery whatever.
Love it.
And yeah, and then there was this like socialite with her little dog that almost blew her cover. So, and I just kept thinking like those are the stories I would watch
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
series.
I mean, honestly, that's the thing these days is true crime. This is a
Mhm.
true crime film noir. So it's like, it's
Yep.
1940 in New York, Nazis, spies, FBI agents,
I
trench
mean,
coats, fedoras, steam rising up out of the streets, people
that's right.
smoking constantly. Like
Hmm.
that this and this with the added benefit of this all actually happened. So
Yeah.
we have one Hollywood star attached to this project. I'm
Ooh.
really, really excited about. I mean, I'm super fortunate because my dad was an actor.
Hmm.
His best friend it happened to be a famous actor. His name is Keira DeLay. He was the star of 2001: Space Odyssey, which is now a much
Yeah.
older film from the
But it's
1960s,
a
but he's
classic.
he's going to play Henry Ford in our film.
Oh, that's so
And
exciting.
he jokes that this will be yet another time he gets to play a Nazi because he played one in a recent very popular show. But I don't want to spoil it in case anybody's still watching it.
Okay.
But if you look it up, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah, so we're really hoping that his presence and the subject matter will draw out some support. I know that everybody is looking for support for all sorts of things right now,
Hmm.
and there's plenty of really important causes that are much more essential than my movie. But I'm hoping that we can use this to have a discussion, just like we're having now about that it wasn't 1940 wasn't we nobody knew if we were going to turn against the Nazis or not, and Nazis are here operating right now with businessmen, and this and so we need, because it's so relevant. i'm hoping that I'm hoping that people will also see what I see, and help make it come to pass.
Well, so and going off of that, because I know I want to be respectful of your time. Like I would just like if I could, I'd be like, all right, I'm talking to Jay for 4 hours. We're gonna dig into this. I want to learn all the stories, but I want to be respectful of your time. So I guess one thing I want to think about because thinking about 1940 and how we could have, right? Like we were right on the brink of like, well,
Yep.
there were very powerful people rubbing elbows, with the Nazis, and now we're seeing that happen again with folks like
Yeah.
Steve Bannon,
Yep.
like what is it, Steve Mnuchin, um,
Mnuchin, Gorka, all
exact.
these guys. Yeah.
So
Roger Stone.
exactly, I mean, God, yeah, basically the whole speakers list of CPAC is
Yes.
so, but like so thinking about why luckily for us in 1940 we Nazism didn't take hold. Um, so thinking about maybe what we can take from how it was prevented, then
Hmm.
you know, aside from there being a war, because I'm sure when you see like, when we were attacked on Pearl Harbor and stuff, and the
Yeah.
Japanese were allied, like I have a feeling that made the our opposition clear. But for now, like, should people look out for? Like, how do we prevent this from taking hold and becoming?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough because it's easy to feel helpless and small. Like this is a game for powerful people, and I just have to kind of sit and hope somebody doesn't shoot up my synagogue, which now is more security thanks to Trump. That's great.
Jeez.
But there is some things we can do. I think one thing we've learned, both past and present, is that deplatforming works.
Hmm.
I won't ruin the whole story for you, but we got rid of that Nazi spy in 1940, and he wasn't a force that could just be around spreading his Nazism and trying to gain power. So uh, we got rid of him, and then now where we've been begging Twitter for years, ban the Nazis, and then Trump was banned, and then
Mm-hmm.
now I think he has a lot less power. But we can deplatforming starts at home. Don't don't signal boost stuff just to say it's bad. Screenshot things,
Mm-hmm.
or better yet, like be like, you know what? They suck. Block them. Move on. Let's have a conversation about raising the minimum wage. Let's talk about things we want to do. Let's talk
Yes.
about creating green infrastructure and green batteries. I got my science hat on. Like there's really exciting things we could talk about. Let's
Mm-hmm.
imagine. Let's use our imaginations to imagine a better world instead of focusing on, oh, isn't this terrible, which is so easy to do. I think it's almost like we don't even know we're doing it, but it's like we have to
Yeah.
kind of be mindful. So that's one thing. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing is that cynicism is fertile ground for fascism, um,
Mm-hmm.
hopelessness,
Mm.
and cynicism. This is something I really appreciate you having my show, because every podcast I've been on, I really want to just give this little story and pass this on.
Mm-hmm.
There's an essay I also wrote about it on my bio on my Twitter. But
Mm-hmm.
hope is not hope is really powerful, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not based on facts. Hope is an act of will
Mm-hmm.
against cynicism. And I learned this lesson from working at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in
Mm.
D.C. and studying the Holocaust as a researcher. And I discovered it through this story about this guy named Rudolf Verba. Rudolf Verba was a young man, I think early 20s,
Hmm.
and he was picked up and sent to Auschwitz. And when at this time period, Auschwitz was kind of a work in progress for most of the time. It started as a factory because Germany needed to make a lot of synthetic rubber because they couldn't get rubber supplies. But anyway, but then it became a death camp. But so they're constantly kind of building there. And what happens is that when you get there, they take the strong people who can help build the camp,
Mm-hmm.
make them into kind of worker slaves, and then they kill everybody else.
Right.
So Verba is there, and he's in part of this crew that's helping to build this death camp, and he's watching people go in and out, and it's horrible. I mean, he's watching, untold thousands of people die. They're building the electric fence,
Mm-hmm.
completing it around the camp, and you're hearing stories about just endless German victories. Nobody can stop the German military machine. They're
Mm-hmm.
going into Russia. Nobody can stop them. So there's and one by one in his cohort of people that are originally picked up and brought, they all kind of lose hope. And
Hmm.
this is a very physically challenging environment.
Yeah.
It's really easy to get a disease and get sick. There's starvation. You can look at a guard wrong and they just shoot you. You can look at a guard wrong and they send you to body detail, which is pretty much a death sentence because you're going to get sick from handling the dead bodies of people who've been gassed or whatever.
Jeez.
It's horrible. And I'm sorry. I should have given a trigger warning or
That's
content
okay.
warning first. This is horrible, right? But and one by one, his cohort lose hope, and one by one they die in various ways until he's the last one of his cohort. But he decides somehow that like that he's not going to he's not going to give into cynicism. That seems to be one of the things that is causing people to die. Just as a survival trait, he's gonna be hopeful, and he's just going to hold on to that like I'm going to, it's an act of will and even defiance against this hate and this violence around him, that he's not going to give in to hopelessness. So eventually, like, he gets a better job in this office where he starts hearing about um, what they're building and everything, and he makes friends, and he manages to figure out where they haven't completed the electric fence yet, and he figures out where he can get some clothes. And I'm screwing up the story a little bit. What
It's
he's
okay.
hearing in that office is that they're going to kill a lot more Jews. So he's like,
Ah.
I got to get out of here and warn people.
Mm-hmm.
So then, and which is, it's crazy to even conceive that, but because he's got this hope that he's holding on to, he can even conceive of it because he hasn't given up hope.
Mm-hmm.
So he figures out where they haven't completed the electric fence. He finds out there's like a trash can essentially,
Mm-hmm.
and he gets clothes, he gets papers, and he goes and he like hides in this trash can. And the guards and the dogs are looking for him for days, and then he escapes. He's one of the very few people ever to escape from Auschwitz just so he can warn people. And his message in this, there's a book, it's called I Escaped Auschwitz. Easy title to find. Um, Basically, the lesson I get from that is that hope is not, I see all these facts and then I decide whether or not I'm going to be hopeful. It's literally, especially in the face of fascism and hate, it is literally an act of defiance, an act of survival, and an act of will. And to me, that's like the uh, that's helped me get through the last several years and through all that has happened because we have to hold on to that. We can't give in to the cynicism. We have to be able to be hopeful and to imagine a better future where we have some agency and some control, each of us in our own lives, to fight back against this. So thank you again for giving me a platform to talk about it. I really appreciate it.
Of course, and my God, I mean, like that is such a. I love that story. And also, a good friend of mine from college, I believe she interned one summer at the National Holocaust Museum, and she also, yeah, grew up in a Jewish household, and so obviously it takes on such a deeper meaning. Especially, I think she said her grandparents had been in concentration camps in the Holocaust, so so great. I've been to the museum too. For everyone watching, if you haven't, next time you're in DC, oh my gosh, you have to go check it out. I mean, it will it will reach like the depths of your soul, and you might have to like sit by yourself afterwards and let it all like sink in, but it's phenomenal. So, and this is the kind of stuff we have to do if we want to make sure that we can be forces for good
Yeah,
and prevent these things from happening again. And I have been called by many people a serial optimist
there you
because
go. Good.
because I agree. It's like because I know my like keeping hope and optimism, and always trying to find a way to make something work, and believing in your own power. It's infectious. It's
Yeah.
contagious. Like it rubs off on the people around you and makes them believe too. And yeah, but like again, Jay, thank you so much for coming on. I'm also, so you're aware, I'll upload this video to YouTube as well
Cool.
so people can check it out. And then I think I mean, I'm so excited to hear how the series pitch and everything goes. And I
Yeah.
mean, I'm gonna have to, once I get this, channel bigger, I'm gonna have you come back on.
Sure.
The
Be
people
happy
demand
to.
it.
Well, who's to say stand against the will of the people?
Right, there you go. That's the real truth. But anyways, thank you so much for coming, everyone. I have shared Jay's Twitter information and everything else in the chat, but I will do it again on Twitter so that you can follow him. Elusive Films and
Elusive Films,
the
or you can,
Nazi.
Nazi on Wall Street. You can donate to my Patreon. There's a link on my Twitter as well. We're freelance historians. We're surviving, month to month. So all the support is welcome and appreciated. And Maddie, I'm deeply grateful that and we have to talk more.
Yes, absolutely. But in any case, Jay, thank you so much. And yeah, I'll end the Zoom and then I'll send you on your way. So have a good rest
All
of your
right.
evening, sir.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.